This is CZ-75 SP-01 Shadow Phantom range report. Let's hit the range.
I'm going to do the bottom target. Oh wow, that sight shines up fantastic in the full bright. Looks like better than HD. That's amazing. I wish I could get that sight on everything. That sight's amazing.
The SP-01 Phantom is a polymer version of the popular SP-01 done by CZ. The slide also has some additional milling on it to help get the weight down. And this gun was primarily made to be the service weapon of the Czech military and police, and it's since been discontinued again on the civilian market by CZ. We usually see this gun come out for a few years at a time, which usually coincides, from what I can tell, with when they get contracts to pump out a bunch more for the government or whatever. The appeal of it as a duty weapon would be, it would be, as in at least my experience, as reliable as the metal frame versions of this gun, though it is quite a bit lighter. Having the polymer frame and then the extra milling on the slide to get that weight down does help. Though, conversely, you do get a little more recoil as a result, which is why I have that flashlight on there. Another mentionable is, due to the subtle slide differences, not all holsters that fit the SP-01 will fit the SP-01 Phantom, so keep that in mind. To emulate the look of the Black Shadow and the Shadow Target 2, I have polished the barrel on my Phantom. It was originally that black anti-rust coating, which, without that, I'm going to have to be careful on making sure it's oiled, but it sure looks flashy. Not quite as much. And here's the crown or face of the barrel. You can see it's kind of polished. You also can slightly see that the guide rod has been changed for a heavier guide rod. And then I've also installed the Dawson fiber optic front sights that I'm a huge fan of. I was given in a toss-in from a box order from Cajun at some point this race hammer, and since I had it on hand, I figured I might as well use it in this build since I knew it would work in this Phantom. It lowers the signal action and double action trigger pull slightly. I retained the standard stock duty rear sight because I wanted to sort of have the same duty nature of the gun. Though, as you can see, here's the sight picture of that high visibility front sight. Now, in addition to those changes, internal springs were changed. I have a lighter hammer spring, a lighter recoil spring, a different firing pin spring, and probably some other springs. Basically, every spring in the gun was changed out when I had this gun taken apart a few years ago, setting up this build. Now, before we get to the pros and cons and why you would do something like this, how about a little more range time?
I might double tap a couple of these. First shot, double action. And double shot, double tap. Here we go. Again. Get way better on target quicker with my Beretta. It's because the muzzle's heavier.
I haven't shot this gun in a couple years, unfortunately, which explains why those double taps were terrible. But shooting it, man, it's reminded me how much fun this gun was to shoot both before and after this setup. Oh, it's so much fun. Let's talk about the pros and cons of this setup. Now, the pros on this would be Compared to the stock Phantom, changing the recoil spring, adding the heavier guide rod, and the flashlight, those three things together help, I'm going to say, significantly lower the recoil on it. Now, it doesn't get it down to the level of, say, my CZC Shadow Target 2 that was set up by CZ Custom, and a lot of that has to do with, even with the changes made to this gun, it's still at a significant weight disadvantage compared to that competition gun. Now, this is a duty gun that's made to be light, and so I'd probably have to add a weight to the front of it, not a flashlight, to actually get closer to what, say, that Target 2 does in terms of recoil. Now, that being said, compared to when this gun was stock, or even compared to my SP-07, which is a polymer frame 9mm done by CZ, this gun has quite a bit less recoil than either of those two. Now, I also have a lighter trigger pull both in the single action and in the double action by virtue of the spring changes and some very minor amateur polishing. Now, my trigger does not have the awesome lack of take-up and things like the ones done by the professionals at CZ Custom. I have to figure out how they do that still. But I at least do have some improvement on the trigger pull weight. Off my gauge, the double action trigger comes in between 4 and 4.5 pounds, while the single action trigger is between 2 and 2.5 pounds. Now, because of the lighter recoil spring and lighter hammer spring, it's also easier to articulate the slide on the firearm, and that high visibility front sight is very easy to pick up both on your first shot and then on follow-up shots compared to the stock sight, in my opinion. Now, that doesn't mean that there are only pros in doing this. There are some cons, and they are such that I would say if you're not comfortable doing your own minor at-home gunsmithing, you probably don't want to consider this setup. Now, one big downside of this setup is the spring changes in the recoil spring change. The slide stop now is going to eat more of the impact on that slide coming forward because it's not being buffered quite as much by the spring absorbing that energy. So that slide stop is going to fail on me sooner than it would have otherwise. It's just a known point of failure that's going to happen on a setup like this. It happens on competition guns, not the Phantom, so I know it's going to happen on this one as well. That probably means that other parts and springs on the inside are probably going to fail sooner than they would have otherwise as well, which probably then puts this gun outside of the range of being, say, a duty gun and more in the range of being a competition or a range toy at this point. And while I think most of the parts on the inside are interchangeable with other models, I don't know if all the pins and whatnot, as far as the polymer frame, are interchangeable with other models. So with this being discontinued, I don't know if you'll actually be able to get 100% of the parts if there are failures. Like, I bought extra slide stops, but at some point, if something else fails that I don't have on hand, I don't know if I'm going to be able to get it. Hopefully I will. Now, another point to mention here about changing springs, like the hammer spring, when you put it in a lighter hammer spring, that's going to lower the force that the hammer then impacts the firing pin, which then hits your primer to set off your cartridge. Now, a lighter spring lessens that impact, and if, say, you have a hard primer and you change just the hammer spring, you could end up in a situation where you don't have enough impact energy to hit off the primer, which I've done. And that is why websites that sell parts, like, say, a reduced hammer spring, will also mention it's a good idea to buy a reduced power firing pin spring and to balance your springs, or you will get misfires or have reliability issues. How about we break up this talking point with a little more range time? Now, here's a picture I took 3 years ago when I was taking things apart, so I would have a reference picture for knowing how to put it back together. And you can see the stock hammer that I've since changed out. You can see in the next picture where I was going to try to use a flat face trigger that didn't actually fit. Here you can see that frame cage that the sear and all these different parts sit into taken apart, and that flat face trigger I was trying to use that I mentioned. And I mean, there's a lot of little springs. You basically have to do reverse Jenga or something to get this thing back together. It was not easy. I would say one of the more difficult CZs I've worked on in that regard because of that frame cage that everything sits inside, that you have to sort of build it sitting inside the frame of the gun. Now, obviously, I got the gun back together and working well, but it took me, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 times going to the range and back to actually get this gun working properly because of how difficult that frame cage was to get the sear and all that properly in line, in my opinion. I found it very difficult to work with, and that was built for a right-handed person, we're going to say. I'm left-handed, working on stuff left-handed, and this one, if you're right-handed, I think it made it more difficult to be a lefty. Now, as far as why you would do something like this, well, I think you'd probably do it because maybe you have the same thought that I do, that you have a shadow, a black shadow, a shadow target 2 or something like that, and you want to see if you can try to emulate it yourself, that you have something that you want to work on and try to spice up, and you're like, oh, well, I'm only going to use this at the range and for fun, so let's see how much fun we can have with it, but still be safe about it. And, that's kind of what I tried to do here. Not everything has to be just a duty gun. It's perfectly okay to have something that was intended to be a duty gun and turn it into a range gun and a competition gun. So that's what I tried to do here. And man, this gun is fun to shoot. It has mild recoil, it's reliable, you can shoot it fast, the sights are easy to pick up. It's basically a dream. And well, at some point, yeah, I'm going to have to replace more parts on it that are going to fail, like the slide stop. Hopefully it's just the slide stop, which is just an easy pop in, pop out, boom, done, fix. But until then, man, this thing is going to be a joy to shoot, and I'm really glad I did it. Learned a lot along the way, too. Well, I hope you found this video useful. Thanks for watching. And as always, have a good day.